The mid-90s represented something of an adjustment period for Sonic. The franchise had been a critical darling since basically day one, but these next few years would come to represent its growing pains. Sonic 3 and Knuckles had gracefully capped off the mainline trilogy. Tetralogy? Pentalogy? It's 4 games, but Sonic 3 was split into 2, But as the gaming scene was shifting into 3D with the upcoming console generation, SEGA seemed unsure of the future of the Hedgehog. And in these uncertain times, sometimes the best thing to do is just throw a bunch of crap at the wall and see if anything sticks. I'm pretty sure 1995 holds the record for the highest number of Sonic games released in a single year, not counting ports or re-releases. 5 unique games bearing the Sonic brand came out within a 7-month span. That's roughly 1 game every month and a half. And yet, not one of these games are what we would consider mainline. While a team at SEGA of America was busy developing a proper Sonic title for the Saturn, scheduled for release the following year, several sub-teams elsewhere in the company would be tasked with building several spin-off games, mostly for the Game Gear. The first of these Game Gear spin-offs was Sonic Drift 2. While the first Sonic Drift game was a Japan exclusive, the sequel did actually see worldwide release. They even kept the 2 in the title in North America, although Europe would rename it to simply Sonic Drift Racing. All 4 racers return from the first game, Sonic, Tails, Amy, and Dr. Eggman, and are joined by 3 more. Knuckles in The Tempest, Fang in his trusty hoverbike, the Marvelous Queen, and Metal Sonic in The Blue Devil. So even though the races are still only 4-player, you have more options this time. It's also funny that they had to misspell Knuckles' name so it would fit the text box. Once again, each character has a skill or attack they can use at the cost of 2 rings, and these typically come in 3 varieties: a speed boost, a jump, or laying some sort of trap for other racers. Fang can lay down oil slicks, and Metal Sonic gets a more powerful version of Sonic's speed boost, with the caveat of costing 3 rings instead of 2. Knuckles is unique in that he has 2 possible abilities. In most instances he'll jump like Tails, but if he's close enough to another racer, he'll instead punch them to spin them out. You can also deliberately block racers behind you in order to spin them out, and I bring that up because I'm not sure if you could do that in the first game or not. Sonic Drift 1 was so easy that I just never even tried it. The gameplay follows the same basic formula as the first game, but everything has more complexity to it. The racetracks include ones based on stages from Sonic 2 and 3, but also with original courses mixed in as well. In addition to standard 3-lap courses are marathon courses with defined start and end points. The returning invincibility, speed up, jump, and bomb power-ups are supplemented with new ones that stop time or swap your left and right steering. And courses are also occupied by more hazards. There are pits, strong gusts of wind, mud and rocks, and sometimes even badniks that seek out and attack racers. The courses themselves are also more varied in layout. Some courses have no edges, resulting in the player falling out of bounds should they not take corners well. A few have you traveling through narrow tunnels that make it easier to crash into the walls or other racers. Ice Cap features high curved walls along its turns that affect your steering, and Emerald Ocean takes place entirely over water, requiring racers to maintain top speed in order to hydroplane, lest they sink under and have to waste several seconds waiting to be pulled out. There are 3 different circuits to choose from just like before, each of increasing difficulty. Except this time, each circuit features an entirely different selection of courses, as there are a lot more than last time. The first game had 6 courses that would just repeat in slightly more complex layouts for each circuit. This time, Sonic Drift 2 features 14 unique courses, and 4 of those also receive an Act 2 variant, for a total of 18. Depending on your placement at the end of each race, you'll move higher in the circuit's overall ranking, but getting first in a race also grants you one of the Chaos Emeralds. In the blue circuit, the hardest one, if you collect all 6 emeralds by placing first in every race, you'll unlock an extra one-on-one race against either Dr. Eggman or Sonic, depending on which character you're playing as. Fans of Sonic 3 might enjoy the music in this race, by the way. And for a deeper cut, fans of the Game Gear Sonic 2 may also recognize the music for the Death Egg course. Those who saw my review of the first Sonic Drift will remember that I said that the game really lacked substantial content and felt pathetically easy. Thankfully, Drift 2 takes great strides to correct both these issues. There are more characters, courses, and mechanics to play around with this time, but also the CPU in this game is absolutely not playing around. Sonic Drift 2 is actually pretty darn difficult at times. Not only do rings and power-ups no longer respawn with each new lap, but there's also some very obvious rubber banding going on. If you ever find yourself taking a wide lead in a race, don't expect it to last very long. The CPU racers are way more aggressive this time. Whereas in the last game I mentioned that the AI racers will never use their special moves or pick up any power-ups, that's absolutely not the case in this one. They'll do everything in their power to get ahead. And while I'm not absolutely sure of this next part, it seemed to me like the CPU doesn't even require rings to activate their special abilities. And if that's the case, that's actually pretty wild, especially when you're racing against Metal Sonic. His dash ability is faster and lasts longer than Sonic's, but as a result requires an extra ring to balance things out. But if it is indeed true that the CPU doesn't actually need to use rings, that makes any race with Metal Sonic extremely annoying and frustrating as he just spams the move as much as he can. I'm glad the game puts up more of a challenge this time, but after a while I started to actively avoid picking Metal Sonic among my opponents solely due to this. Overall, Sonic Drift 2 improves on the first game in basically every way. Well, there are no individualized character endings this time. Every racer gets the same generic credit sequence, which is a bit of a bummer, but that's quite literally the only thing I think the first game did better. This feels like an actual full-fledged game this time, as opposed to a glorified demo. You can safely skip the first Sonic Drift. It's a boring game that comes and goes in less than 20 minutes, and it makes total sense that it never left Japan. But I feel like you could have a decent amount of fun with this one, especially if you manage to get other players willing to play with you. If you're a fan of kart racers, especially retro kart racers, give this one a look.
You are approaching Saturn. You are only second.
Sega's switch from 16 to 32 bits is probably the clumsiest transition between console generations there's ever been from a major games publisher. By the mid-90s, Sega had somehow formed a major rift within its own company, as the American and Japanese branches, for all intents and purposes, absolutely hated one another. Sega of America saw the Japanese branch as uptight and out of touch. Meanwhile, Sega of Japan took huge issue with the way the Americans presented and marketed their products, seeing their potshots at competitors as improper and lowbrow. It's also been said that Sega of Japan seemed to harbor a certain jealousy toward their overseas teammates, as despite Sega being largely a Japanese-run company by this point, it seemed like Sega products were popular everywhere except Japan. This not-so-friendly rivalry within the company would extend even to the development of their next major console, the Saturn. The Saturn was being created almost entirely in Japan, and despite input and pushback on several of the machine's specs and features from Sega America execs, the Japanese teams would refuse to budge on nearly every issue. Eventually, the Americans decided to do their own thing, and in an effort to extend the lifespan of the still relatively popular Genesis, Sega of America decided to release a new add-on for the console that would be able to provide the aging machine with enhanced sound and colors, as well as next-generation 32-bit graphics, including 3D rendered and textured polygons. And so, in late 1994 would come the Sega 32X. Due to Sega rushing the 32X out the door, they weren't immediately able to secure a whole lot of new software for it. The peripheral launched with only around 6 games, some of which were just enhanced ports of existing Genesis titles. Sega America's CEO at the time, Tom Kalinske, of course wanted a Sonic game to drive sales of the new add-on, and so a prototype Genesis game under the working title Sonic Crackers was chosen to be reworked for the new 32X. While always intended to be a mainline title, somewhere along the way it was decided that this new Sonic game would not star Sonic himself, but rather Knuckles, and featuring an ensemble cast of supporting characters which could take full advantage of the prototype game's new central mechanic. That being, 2 players linked together by a rubber band, needing to work together to traverse a series of levels. Knuckles Chaotix, known as simply Chaotix outside of North America, follows the titular echidna along with a ragtag group of supporting characters as they attempt to thwart Dr. Eggman. The Doctor plans to harness the power of the Chaos Rings that suddenly formed on a mysterious island risen from the sea, upon which he has constructed his new base, the New Tragic High Zone. The game's levels all fall into the theme of amusement park attractions, and in fact are literally called attractions here as opposed to zones. The American manual would even rewrite the story to lean more into this aesthetic, christening the game's setting as Carnival Island, and changing its origin into that of a high-tech amusement park. Knuckles Chaotix includes a host of playable characters, a total of 7, with a few asterisks, we'll get to it, and of those, only 2 are returning from older games, including Knuckles himself. The game begins with a short intro level where Knuckles rescues Espio the Chameleon from being turned into a statue by Dr. Eggman, who is accompanied by Metal Sonic. From here, the game begins to introduce you to its new central mechanic via a full-fledged tutorial level. Knuckles Chaotix binds 2 playable characters together with a band of ring energy, resulting in the characters being able to fling one another about and create or alter momentum depending on their movement. This was apparently inspired by the classic kids' toy Clackers, which is actually where the working title Sonic Crackers came from. The game can be played with either 1 or 2 players, and speed can be gained by creating tension on your rubber band by pulling in one direction and then releasing in the other. Characters can even pick up and throw one another. Each of the 3 face buttons on the controller serves a different function. 1 for jumping and spin dashing, 1 for interacting with your partner, either holding them in place or grabbing them to throw depending on vicinity, and 1 that recalls the partner character to your current position should they become stuck somewhere, which costs 10 rings. This also makes this the only Sonic game where you can actually reach a ring deficit. Levels are broken up by a sort of hub world, which consists of an exit to the title screen on one side and a level launcher at the end. The primary or Player 1 character is selected at the File Select screen, while the partner character is decided via this crane game where you can attempt to select the partner you desire. Each character has access to the spin dash as well as their own unique skills, similarly to Sonic 3. Espio the Chameleon can stick to and run up walls. Mighty the Armadillo can wall jump even on a single wall, Mega Man X style. Knuckles of course has his returning glide and climb moves, and Vector the Crocodile has an 8-directional air dash and can also climb walls. Charmy B is easily the most broken in terms of movement. Although he has no good offensive options since he lacks a spin dash, he makes up for it with infinite 8-directional flight. And his tiny sprite means he can more easily avoid enemies and obstacles and fit in smaller gaps. The robots, Heavy and Bomb, are also available as partners, there to represent the booby prizes for doing poorly at the crane game. Heavy is, well, heavy, meaning he's difficult to throw and fling around and will drastically affect your airtime, while Bomb is a danger to Player 1, as any hit he suffers will result in an explosion. Not counting the robots, the only character in this game who is truly new is Espio, designed by manga artist Takumi Miyake. Mighty had previously been playable in the arcade game SEGASonic the Hedgehog, Vector was planned to appear in Sonic 1 but was scrapped, and Charmy is a repurposed version of a character from the old Koro Koro Sonic manga. You may notice that each of the characters' abilities revolve around either aerial or vertical movement, and that's for good reason. The attractions in Knuckles Chaotix are all very vast and built around verticality. There's a lot of boxed-in areas, a lot of looping side to side, even some light puzzle solving by hitting switches to activate elevators or raise a cruise ship. I think it's also the first Sonic game to have a fail state other than a standard game over. If you reach the goal ring in Amazing Arena without finding and turning on the power switch first, you'll fail and have to try again. Similar to your character selection being a game of chance, the order you play the levels is also determined by a roulette, and each attraction has 5 acts. Depending on how much time is spent in an act, the next one may move on to a different time of day, from morning to midday to evening to night, each growing progressively more difficult. Time of day is guaranteed to change every 2 acts, but only by playing poorly and slowly will you be forced to play the hardest version of each level. Every Act 5 ends with a boss fight, and upon winning, that attraction will be removed from the roulette. Whenever the player has at least 20 rings, giant rings appear at certain points in each act that bring the player to a bonus stage, where they can collect power-ups, rings, and points while falling down an endless void, and are booted out when either their ticking ring counter hits 0 or they hit an exit block. There are no Chaos Emeralds this time, but instead the 6 Chaos Rings, acquired by bringing 50 rings to the end of an act like in Sonic 1 or CD. The special stages are similar to those in Sonic 2, but instead of a half-pipe you have a fully 3D rotating gravity tunnel, with the goal of gathering the required amount of blue spheres without falling into a pit or running out of time, with rings once again acting as the countdown. These special stages are easily the most technically impressive aspect of Knuckles Chaotix, as they feature true 3D polygons on ostensibly 16-bit hardware. Once you've cleared all 6 special stages, they start to loop all over again, but this time all the polygons are transparent wireframes, which is not only a way for the game to show off, but also offers a lot more challenge, as it becomes more difficult to figure out where pits are. Unfortunately, the special stages are probably also the most fun part of Knuckles Chaotix. The standard gameplay of this game is strange and clunky, The central rubber band mechanic feels restrictive, annoying, and slow, and individual character movement feels sluggish. Knuckles' glide feels downright lethargic, and his climbing speed has been greatly reduced from Sonic 3, which isn't great because his climbing wasn't all that fast to begin with. And to top it off, the spin dash has been nerfed all to hell, and I feel like the only real reason these changes were made was in an attempt to highlight and emphasize the individual character abilities and the new clacker-style movement. The spin dash feels slow and lazy because they want you to use the rubber band to fling yourself instead. But that process is slower, more complicated, and requires more space and preparation than a simple spin dash would. It's inferior in every way, and drastically reducing the spin dash's overall usefulness shows that the developers knew that. The game is also really just kinda boring. Despite the level's often chaotic layouts, no pun intended, they somehow feel barren at the same time. Lots of wide open space without much happening. I didn't even seem to encounter that many enemies to contend with. The game was just really easy. It's almost like the dev team knew the real challenge for players would be the stupid rubber band. Almost any combat situation can be tackled handily just by throwing your partner over and over. Your partner character only loses one ring when hit, and even if you do run out of rings, the game doesn't actually have lives. It just boots you to the hub world. But despite the deserted feel of the levels, the game features a confoundingly large variety of temporary power-ups. In fact, more than almost any other Sonic game ever made, and very few of these would ever be seen again. There's the returning shield, invincibility, speed-ups, and ring boxes you'd expect from Sonic at this point, but also grow and shrink boxes, which temporarily alter your character's size accordingly. And I'm fully convinced that these were only included to show off that the 32X could do sprite scaling, as they barely affect gameplay at all. There are boxes that swap the player 1 and 2 characters, or switch one character out for another one entirely, also largely pointless. The bonus stages feature separate character and level select items, which make it easier to choose specific partners or stages from the corresponding pool. The only new power-up I did find useful, and thus the only one that would eventually return in a future Sonic game, was the Combine Ring, which will combine all your current rings into a single gray ring when you're struck, making it easier to recollect your entire total upon taking damage. But even then, I'm not convinced this game needed yet another way to make it even easier. There's also, as far as I can tell, no elegant way to switch out the Player 1 character without just completely exiting to the title screen and loading your file up again. And the game doesn't just feel easy, it's also repetitive. Upping the number of acts per stage from 2 or 3 to a whopping 5 was definitely overkill here, especially since, aside from the time of day, I could not tell you what actually changes from act to act. It quite literally just feels like the game made me play each level 5 times. It seems like this game was largely built with multiplayer in mind, but even if that's the case, I really can't fathom how that would make the game substantially better. I understand that maybe they wanted to address the somewhat toothless co-op multiplayer of past Sonic games, wherein player 2 could never truly die, but the type of cooperative teamwork this game's central mechanic seems to encourage would really only work in a platformer much more tightly built around precision jumps and pure puzzle solving, rather than the more open and free-form level design classic Sonic games were known for. Think something like, say, Celeste, but having 2 players bound together. Here, having a partner character quite literally handcuffed to you only succeeds in being annoying and slowing down the gameplay in all the wrong ways. But, to give credit where it's due, I do think Knuckles Chaotix is great in terms of look and sound. Chaotix was developed by a lot of the same staff who worked on Sonic CD, minus Naoto Oshima, and it shows in the game's visual and sound design. The 32X allowed for the use of over 32,000 colors, as opposed to the meager 64 colors of the standard Genesis. And the dev team really went wild, creating a lot of eclectic and psychedelic-looking stages. The environments and backgrounds all follow that sort of mid-90s maximalist look, where it feels like the level artists just had a field day putting random stuff everywhere. The music is great as well, with the theme for Speed Slider in particular sticking out in my mind. I should also say that the game's setting of a giant amusement park full of a variety of attractions to run around in is also just a really cool concept to me. And in fact, this idea would be revisited in 1 or 2 Sonic games down the line. After all, what are Sonic levels if not interactive roller coasters? But honestly, the most concise way I can sum up Knuckles Chaotix would be, it's just weird. And I feel like I've always sort of known that Knuckles Chaotix was weird. I mentioned in my Sonic CD video that the version of that game I grew up with was the 1996 PC port, And included in the files for that game was a bunch of promo material for this game, like character bios and such. And as a middle school-age Sonic fan with no internet access, I would read that stuff over and over just for fun. The game seemed fascinating, probably mostly due to the forbidden fruit element of a game I'd never seen for a console I'd never heard of, but even then I could still tell how downright strange this game was. Around 2007 or so, I played the game for the first time on the GameTap online service. Yeah, anyone remember GameTap? Of course you don't. Well, I got a GameTap subscription solely because Knuckles Chaotix was on it. And it was literally the only game I ever played on GameTap before the service closed down. And yeah, the game was weird, but as a Sonic fan, it was a neat little novelty to finally be able to play it. And now that I've played the game again to make this video, and now that I've had to actually take notes and analyze the game critically, I can safely say Knuckles Chaotix is a really fucking weird game. It's like a mirror image parallel to Yoshi's Island. Both were spin-offs starring relatively new supporting characters, both introducing new mechanics to innovate and evolve a formula that the creators felt had run its course, and both were made as a final attempt to show off the technical features of a console that was already on the way out the door. But Chaotix failed in all the ways Yoshi succeeded. Where Yoshi's Island felt like Miyamoto's team truly testing themselves to see if they could break free of the classic Mario formula and create something new and unique, Chaotix comes off as little more than a poor justification for the release of an unnecessary peripheral on a console that was already obsolete. And to call critic reception to Knuckles Chaotix polarizing would be putting it lightly. The rubber band mechanic, while acknowledged as an honest attempt to innovate, was largely panned as clunky and unorthodox. Many critics seem to share my issues with the game's low difficulty and level design, describing the game as feeling empty or even unfinished. The large roster of unique playable characters was praised, as were the special stages, but overall, Chaotix was largely considered an interesting game on the surface that was deeply flawed under the hood. It was the first major blemish on the so far spotless track record of console Sonic titles. And while I praised the game's look and its technical achievements, a few critics couldn't even agree on those, with at least one major outlet at the time describing the game's graphics as garish, and others found its attempts to show off the 32X tech unimpressive. Some even went so far as to wonder why the game couldn't have just been a standard Genesis title. One critic did point out that Chaotix is probably the best game for the 32X, but that's admittedly not a high bar to clear. Knuckles Chaotix would also fail in its goal to push sales of the 32X. The peripheral would completely flop, selling around 800,000 units in total, barely over a third of the already underwhelming Sega CD. Only 40 games in total would be released for the add-on, and 6 of those also required you to own a Sega CD. And as the 32X flopped, so too did Chaotix, selling a measly 24,000 total units, at a time when other mainline Sonic games were easily pushing several million. This failure, combined with the somewhat convoluted nature of 32X architecture, would also result in Knuckles Chaotix becoming one of the rarest Sonic games in terms of accessibility. That 2007 GameTap service was the first and only time the game was ever officially re-released. The only way to play Chaotix today without emulating is to own an actual 32X copy of it. So of course that means cartridges can easily cost hundreds of dollars now. And even at my most generous, I can say that price tag is just not worth it. And Knuckles Chaotix aside, the 32X as a whole would go down as possibly Sega's single biggest mistake. The pivotal event that would snowball into the company's fall from grace as both a Nintendo competitor and a console manufacturer. The 32X, an extraneous, unnecessary add-on to a long outdated console, releasing at almost the exact same time as the Saturn, sowed a lot of distrust and frustration among consumers. Many of those who did buy the 32X were disheartened to almost immediately learn that the actual next-gen Sega console was coming out in just a few months, rendering the device they had just put down hundreds of dollars on completely redundant. People on the fence found themselves confused by which console they should actually buy, and so, in many cases, that would just result in them buying neither and deciding to camp with Sony or Nintendo instead. Sega intentionally saturating and obfuscating their own catalog would result in all but the most die-hard Sega fans jumping ship from ever buying a console from the company again. And all because the two rivaling branches of Sega were just petty enough to not care. Knuckles wasn't the only Sonic character to get his own spin-off game in 1995 either. Tails would get two, in fact, both for the Game Gear. The first of these is one of the most bizarre entries in the Sonic library, Tails Skypatrol. Released only in Japan, Tails Skypatrol is not a traditional platformer, and instead plays more like a side-scrolling space shooter a la Gradius, except without the actual shooting part. Tails is constantly in flight and cannot stop or turn around, but he can move up and down and can slow down or speed up by holding left or right, respectively. Tails is also carrying a giant ring with him, which he uses to attack enemies, clear breakable obstacles, and interact with his environment, such as flipping switches, swinging along poles, or latching onto moving minecarts. The player has a flight gauge that gradually drains as the level goes on, and this can be replenished by gathering mint candies throughout each stage. And yes, for you Sonic super nerds out there, this game is basically the entire reason why mint is said to be Tails' favorite flavor. It's pretty obvious that this game was made with little kids in mind, like little kids. And if you're gonna make a Sonic game to target a sort of preschool to kindergarten audience, Tails is the perfect character to star. Apparently the game began development as a completely unrelated game for an unreleased black and white console, devised to be a cheaper alternative to the Game Boy. Nobody has any information about this mystery console, and those involved haven't ever spoken about it, but once the project was dropped, SEGA asked if the game could be reworked for the Game Gear to help recoup some of the losses. Because of this clandestine development, a lot of the game's staff remains unknown to this day, and the game's credits only use pseudonyms. There's also evidence that surfaced over the years that the game may have begun development as some sort of Disney tie-in, and starred a character that wasn't Tails. Early footage of the game recently surfaced, which reveals that one of the game's villains, Behringer, was at one point Pete, a character from various Mickey Mouse cartoons. Two other villains from the game, Hawk Wolf and Witchcart, also bear uncanny resemblance to Disney characters, specifically the Big Bad Wolf and Mizrabel, respectively. This could be why we've never seen any of these characters appear in any other Sonic games. Although Witchcart was reworked into the character of Wendy Naugus for the Sonic Archie comics, and the IDW comics did adapt the story of the game in celebration of Tails' 30th anniversary. Despite the clearly younger target audience and possible ties to Disney, Tails Skypatrol can be a deceptively difficult game. The player loses a life if Tails hits the ground, a wall, or an obstacle, and given that the player cannot ever stop Tails from moving, it's easy to see where the game's comparison to space shooters comes from. Quick movement and reaction time is required of the player at basically all times, as well as resource management via keeping Tails' flight meter topped off. One level in particular, Metal Island, made it difficult to discern between which graphical assets were just background elements and which were actual hazards, and that led to a few frustrating moments. The game only consists of 4 levels, not counting the tutorial level, so it's not a long game, but it can be a fairly challenging one, and that's a bit strange considering the game was clearly made for a much younger crowd. It's overall just a bizarre title, and I do not question at all why it stayed in Japan. Such a strange inclusion within the Sonic library, and one that you're not really missing out on by skipping. The second Tails-centric spin-off for the Game Gear was Tails Adventures, which, as the title implies, is a solo adventure starring Tails, wherein he must save Coco Island from the invading forces of the Battle Cuckoo Army. Interestingly, the plot synopsis given in the English and Japanese manuals differ on when the game actually takes place. The Japanese story describes the game as a prequel, taking place before Sonic and Tails met, while the English versions say that Tails is simply on vacation while Sonic is off doing more adventuring. Which one is more correct doesn't really matter in the long run, so you can pick whichever you prefer. I personally like the English interpretation better. Tails Adventures also does not play like a traditional Sonic game, and is best described as a side-scrolling adventure RPG. It has elements of a Metroidvania, wherein you backtrack across various maps over and over as you find more tools to help you reach new areas. Although, in this game, each map is separated by a hub menu, where you can select to visit any area you've already been to. Most areas of the game are split into 2 or 3 screens, each made up of complex networks of mazes and platforms that Tails must navigate to either reach the end or find some kind of new weapon or upgrade. Tails can take flight at any time with a double jump and takes 1 ring of damage every time he's hit, and both his flight and ring gauges are increased each time you find one of the Chaos Emeralds in certain hidden locations. Strong opposing gusts of wind placed in specific spots will also keep the player from just being able to fly over every new obstacle or hazard, keeping the puzzle-solving elements of the game prominent throughout. Tails has his basic jump and fly moves, and can also grab onto ledges to pull himself up during a fall. For whatever reason, however, Tails doesn't spin into a ball in this game, and so his means of attacks are all weapons-based, primarily bombs. The player has an inventory of 4 items they can carry into each level, which they can switch between on the pause screen. Tails has a house on Coco Island that he can visit in between levels to both replenish his rings and swap out his current cache of weapons. These items can include various types of bombs, from basic explosives to remote-activated bombs to napalm grenades that can be used to clear thick brush, UN laws be damned. There are also a variety of support items, like a helmet that protects Tails from damage, night vision goggles to light up dark caves, and special shoes that increase Tails' running speed. By far the most useful, though, is the remote robot. This little drone is your best friend. Both it and Tails are impervious to damage while it's in use, it has unlimited range, and while it can't be used to complete levels, since it can't move from screen to screen, it can fit into small crevices to retrieve items or press switches, or can even just scope out the level ahead of you so you can see what's coming. You acquire the item within the game's first level, and it becomes a practically permanent mainstay to your inventory, as nearly every area of the game requires use of it at least once. There's also a handful of gimmick items, such as the rado, that allows you to change the game's music, or specific puzzle items like the wrench or rocket booster, rocket booter, which are both used in specific levels just to advance the story along. Probably most interesting are the items based on other characters. The Knuckles item grants Tails a punch attack, the Sonic item allows him to do a full-fledged spin dash, and the Fang item doesn't have any active effect, but as long as it's in your inventory, it'll make it more likely for defeated enemies to drop rings. At certain points, Tails gets access to his submarine, the Sea Fox, its second appearance after Sonic Triple Trouble. Obviously, this is used to traverse the game's underwater areas, but it also receives its own separate upgrades and weapons independent of Tails' other items, including torpedoes, mines, 2 types of missiles, a Vulcan gun, a turbo boost, and even an electric field. There's even an upgrade that makes the Sea Fox flat-out impervious to damage, which is obtained by defeating a secret hidden boss deep within the volcanic tunnel. Speaking of bosses, a highlight of the game to me was this boss that you have to fight entirely while flying up a tall, narrow crevice. And there's still a handful of items I'm leaving out here. Tails Adventures is a surprisingly vast and complex game considering the hardware it was built for. There's no built-in save feature, but it provides relatively simple 16-character passwords to track the player's progress in item acquisitions, and upon finishing the game, you're even given an item completion score in true Metroid fashion. Most areas of the game link to at least one other area, but some exist solely for Tails to discover new items that will help him progress elsewhere. And honestly, this is just the perfect type of game for Tails to star in. Tails' personality is such a contrast to Sonic's that I think it would have been lazy to make a Tails spin-off that was just a traditional Sonic game minus the Sonic. No, Tails' defining feature is that he's a giant fucking nerd, and that's what's endearing about him. Having his first solo outing play heavily into that aspect of his character is absolutely perfect. A complex adventure game with heavy emphasis on weapons and tools is exactly what should be done with a character like Tails. Of the 5 games I cover in this video, this is the one I enjoyed the most, and it's not even close. And for those curious, here's a full ranking of all 5 that I threw together in about 2 minutes. As long as you're not insisting on playing a traditional high-speed Sonic game, this one is a lot of fun. I'd even go so far as to say that Tails Adventures is the best Sonic game on the Game Gear. Period. And this is it. This is the game, guys. It's time to talk about Sonic Labyrinth. You think Sonic 06 is bad? You thought Sonic Boom was an embarrassment? Forces was disappointing? You ain't seen nothing yet.
1 hour later.
Yeah, I have no idea how this game became the punching bag that it is among the Sonic fandom. I mean, I kinda do. If the only thing you knew about Sonic Labyrinth was its plot synopsis, then yeah, I agree it does sound really bad and stupid. One day, while Sonic is sleeping, Dr. Eggman secretly replaces his normal shoes with a pair of slow-down boots that will prevent Sonic from being able to run or jump. When Sonic wakes up, he inadvertently puts on the boots, and just like that, he's only able to walk and spin dash. What exactly is preventing him from taking off these boots, I do not know, but apparently he needs the Chaos Emeralds to do so. And yeah, that's a silly premise. But at the same time, it so clearly knows that it's silly. Like, look at the art from the Japanese manual and tell me with a straight face that they didn't know this was dumb. This is a self-aware Looney Tunes quality premise. The little nugget of story only exists to justify the gameplay, which, once again, does not play like a traditional Sonic game. Sonic Labyrinth is an isometric puzzle platformer with the goal of collecting 3 keys in each level and reaching the exit all within a certain time limit. Your time is extended upon collecting each key, and keys will scatter if Sonic takes damage. Sonic is unable to run or jump. The player must either walk or spin dash to move around, with the ability to move in all 8 directions. The spin dash will ricochet off edges and walls, and can be stopped at any time by pressing the button again. Power-ups can be picked up that grant various effects, such as 1-ups, a speed boost, invincibility, a screen nuke, or temporarily freezing the level timer. The game has a total of 4 levels, or labyrinths, each with 3 acts and a boss battle, sticking true to the basic Sonic formula in at least that respect. And there's also a secret bonus level that can be found to receive the last Chaos Emerald. Boss acts contain no keys, instead just granting the player a short opportunity to collect some rings before the battle begins. The basic levels are a series of isometric platforms of varying terrain and size, and there are several methods provided to travel from area to area, ranging from basic moving platforms to springs to cannons. The final labyrinth even features teleporting door mazes, which in most games I would find annoying, but I'm fine with here because the game literally has Labyrinth in the title. Still, you should look up maps though. The player can scope out the layout of each labyrinth at any time by pausing the game and using the directional buttons to scroll the camera. So, I played the game, I beat it, and yeah, I still don't see what warrants all the mockery. I'm not going to try to claim the game is some misunderstood masterpiece, because it's not, but, like, this is what's got us all up in arms, guys, really? This harmless little puzzle game that comes and goes in less than an hour? Get past the goofy premise, and what you have here, honestly, is a sort of testing ground for Sonic 3D Blast. And I understand that that game is also fairly polarizing, but definitely not something that calls for such unanimous hate. I think the fandom is just really desperate for any way to get some heat diverted off of Sonic 06. This is the most nothing Sonic game I've played since the first Sonic Drift. It is so easy to just ignore this game. I guarantee you the vast majority of people have never even heard of it. Don't get me wrong, I don't like this game, but this franchise has done far, far worse, guys. Despite the surprisingly active release schedule of Sonic in 1995, none of these games would go on to represent any sort of landmark for the franchise. In fact, this was the year that kicked off what can now be referred to as the first Sonic Dark Age, a big lull in the franchise's activity that would persist throughout the mid-90s. Following Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the franchise hit a huge slump, with the upcoming Saturn era seeing no mainline Sonic releases at all, only exacerbated by the troubled development and cancellation of Sonic X-treme, the game that was planned to officially carry Sonic into the world of 3D. It would take until the Sega Dreamcast for Sonic to make a proper return, but at the time you perhaps wouldn't be mistaken for thinking that maybe Sonic had just simply run his course.